The reforms of the 4th century by Diocletian and Constantine the Great that revitalized Rome after its crisis in the 3rd century seemed a distant cry in the 380s. Indeed, even the great work of Valentinian I in the 360s seemed a far cry to the Rome of the 380s. With Gratian, his son, and Valentinian II ruling over the West, they were not reliable nor popular because of their beliefs and ideas, especially among the Christians. Meanwhile, Valens had completely embarrassed himself in the East. Being the older uncle to look over his nephews in the West, he had failed to look over his own army, and had been totally decimated at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 by Fritigern, a Goth who had originally served for the Roman Empire but had turned on them when he had received lack of payment, and with his Gothic hordes had invaded the Roman Empire and brought them to their knees. The defeat at Adrianople in 378 cost Valens his security, his power, and his life, as the barbarians overwhelmed the Roman forces, and then turned their eyes and attention towards Constantinople. With the barbarian threat mounting and Valens securely out of the way, an imminent collapse of the Roman Empire seemed very likely, just as it had a century prior. It would need a great ruler to turn back the tide on its chaos and decadence, the fall of its power and prestige, the weakness of its armies, the low birth rates, the large barbarian hordes continuing to swarm its cities and invade, and now threatened Constantinople, the new Rome of Constantine, the new capital built right at the straits of the Black Sea. Indeed, the city of Constantine the Great was in danger from the barbarian hordes, as was the Western Roman Empire with its own capital at Milan, no longer Rome, which was the eternal city, the capital of both the East and the West. Eventually, the Western Roman Empire would move to Ravenna in the early 5th century, its final capital. But the Roman Empire was divided and seemed ready to fall. But things only got worse after Valens' death, as Gratian was usurped and murdered in 383 by Magnentius Maximus, the greatest of the great. He kept the unpopular Valentinian, a heretic to the Christians, as his puppet, and Rome cowered in distress. It needed a great ruler like Constantine. It needed a great ruler even like Valentinian, and it got it in the form of Theodosius. A general who had run Valens' armies soon revitalized the eastern half of the empire, making deals with the barbarians and the Sassanids in order to keep the peace in Rome. Throughout the 380s, he stabilized the Eastern Roman Empire and decided that the best way to do this was through his spirituality and deep religious conviction. The unifying force would be Trinitarian Christianity as defined at the Council of Nicaea. The old days where they were targets of the lions and of the persecutions of Nero's circus seemingly were over. They had been legalized as a sect by Constantine, and they were the largest growing force in the empire, and Constantine was well aware of their influence. Supposedly, he had received the symbol of the cross, put it on his soldier shield, and used it to win the great battle of the Milvian Bridge in 311. With the Edict of Milan in 313, he legalized Christianity and sat in at their council at Nicaea in 325, which declared that Christ was of the same substance as the Father. The theological issue of the divinity of Christ was no longer a religious issue, but a political issue, with Constantine sitting in on their conference. And yes, he accepted baptism at his death. And with only the interruption of Julian the Apostate, who failed to try to bring Rome back to its pagan ways, the empire had become thoroughly Christianized. In both status and birth rate, they outpaced the growth of the pagan Romans, and the emperors were either ostensibly or deeply Christian. And for Theodosius, it was deeply. He not only trusted the message, but he believed strongly that it could bring cohesion to his empire. And cohesion it did bring. Theodosius made Christianity the official religion of the empire in 380, and his new peace treaties and stabilized borders revitalized the eastern half of the empire and brought about a veritable golden age for Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, and its Greek-speaking population, which would come to dominate compared to the feeble and weakening Western Roman Empire during the 5th century. The unsteady peace with the barbarians, however, would turn out to be a mistake, as the precarious resettlement of the barbarians in Roman lands would lead to more invasions and incursions and wrath from the barbarians when they were not paid properly for their military services, leading to more ravaging of the Western Empire and its eventual decline. Over the next century, the barbarians would tear the Western Roman Empire apart as the East flourished. But prolonging the issue, Theodosius preferred an unsteady peace to long, turbulent warfare. His real war would be with fellow Romans, and he would make sure that yet another Roman civil war would end with him as the victor, and in glory as the sole ruler of Rome. Declaring himself emperor in 383 and leading the legions out of northern Gaul and Britannia, probably forever, Magnus Maximus had overthrown and killed Gratian and subordinated Valentinian II. Theodosius answered with war, a civil war that would last 5 years and ensure that Magnus Maximus would never be the emperor of all of Rome. Defeating Maximus, Theodosius restored Valentinian II, establishing the sickly youth as a puppet to do his bidding in the West. When the 22-year-old youth died in 393, Theodosius assumed control of both the East and the West, becoming the final Roman emperor to rule over both, in one of the most successful and accomplished feats, especially for that time. The large lands of Augustus, Trajan, and Constantine were now his. With the barbarian hordes at bay, the Roman civil war over, peace and stability reigning throughout the empire, and Christianity dominating the culture, Theodosius had nothing but to enjoy his time as the emperor, and also to select an heir. Creating a new dynasty, the Theodosian dynasty, he decided to divide the empire between his sons, Arcadius to rule in the east, and Honorius to rule in the west. Both were horrifyingly disappointing and incompetent. Their horrifying reigns do little to take away from the grandeur of their father, who passed away in 395, the last man to rule over all of Rome. Theodosius the Great had brought stability to the empire by consolidating it under a new religion, defeating the Goths, and stabilizing the borders. He had ensured the survival of the empire, especially the eastern half of it, and was the last ruler to rule over both halves. However, at his death, he divided the empire between his two inept sons, Arcadius to take the east and Honorius to take the west, the Theodosian dynasty. Arcadius was weak and ruled by his wife and administrators, while Honorius in the east relied on Flavius Stilicho, a half-barbarian general, to defeat the enemies. Despite the fact that Honorius was too young, Stilicho was good at defeating the barbarians, but to keep the emperor safe, they moved the capital from Milan to Ravenna. This did not stop the barbarian invasions, which Stilicho was unable to put down. But jealous of his power and influence, Honorius had him murdered, showing how inept he was, and the barbarians flooded back into the land, especially the Goths, who under Alaric sacked Rome in 410 for the first time in centuries. Rome continued to be ravaged and divided by the barbarians, and Honorius did nothing. He died in 423. Meanwhile, in the east, after his wife's death, Arcadius continued to be dominated by his ministers until his own death in 408. No great loss. A common historical myth is that the barbarians who destroyed the Roman Empire were all the same, and all were uncivilized and unable to defeat the Romans. It was the Romans who were in decline that allowed them to defeat them. This was not true. First off, they were called barbarians because of the bar sound they made in combat, but they were diverse, many of them coming from Germany and Eastern Europe, settling in the Roman Empire and working with the Romans in order to achieve land, a safe place to stay, and food. It migrated continuously in the 4th and 5th century, especially as the Roman population decreased and Rome needed these barbarians to fight off other barbarians. When they were not paid by the crippling empire with its bad infrastructure and economy, they often went ape, invading the empire and sacking the city, such as Alaric did with the Goths in 410. Indeed, whenever barbarians were not paid or treated fairly, chaos ensued, leading to the sack of Rome and many other cities and the destruction and degradation of the Roman Empire, with the barbarians setting up kingdoms in different areas of the formerly great western half of the Roman Empire, as the barbarians were just too formidable and numerous to defeat. Recovery seemed almost impossible. However, the East stood tall and stood strong, being able to settle with the barbarians, making peace and settling them in their lands as well as keeping up with their payments. They were wealthier and stronger. In 457, Majorian, probably the last decent emperor the West ever had, took power. He desperately tried to restore Roman lands and was pretty successful until Ricimer, an ambitious general, made sure that he was assassinated. Ricimer would continue to appoint figureheads and puppets until 472 when he also was assassinated. And with the West in total chaos, the restoration of it seemed impossible, even with intervention from the East. The barbarians had enacted revenge for years of mistreatment, lack of payment, and for centuries of oppression, conquest, enslavement, torture, and murder. The Roman Empire was on its last legs, only holding on to Italy, small parts of Gaul, and Austria. In 475, another ambitious general, Orestes, put his son, Romulus Augustus, on the throne. Aptly and serendipitously, the little Augustus was named after the founder and first emperor of Rome and would turn out to be its last emperor. Theodosius the Great had breathed life into Rome and brought stability to the empire. As it turned out, however, it was only to be the eastern half that he would revitalize. After the death of the last ruler of both halves of the empire, he divided it amongst his incompetent sons, Arcadius and Honorius. Honorius, one of the worst rulers, not just in Roman history, but in human history, would rule over the West for 30 years, being idle and incompetent, while Arcadius, also incompetent, would rule over the East and be controlled by his ministers and their affairs. With Rome divided once again, the East and the West started to fall apart. And with Rome, the spiritual capital, Ravenna, became the capital of the West, while Theodosius had restabilized and reinvigorated the East and its capital, Constantinople. He had also, as other emperors had, allowed the barbarians to settle in the lands of the Romans and had even hired them to be the fighting force. With declining birth rates, the Roman army comprised more and more barbarian officers, soldiers, and generals throughout the 4th and 5th centuries. These barbarians were then used to fight other barbarian tribes, who then would be placed in the Roman Empire and paid for hire. And when they were not paid or properly treated, they would rebel. And the Roman legionaries were nothing compared to what they had been, and often suffered mightily at the hands of these different barbarian groups, such as the Goths, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Lombards, and others. The glory days of the Pax Romana, with Rome's many great cities, its strong legionaries protecting its borders and expanding its territory, its many roads, all of which led to Rome, and its mighty temples and infrastructure, were all a thing of the past, crumbling under barbarian invasions, political corruption, low birth rates, and an economy that was on the brink of collapse. The worst of this came in 410, when Alaric and his Goths, who had originally been guns for hire for the Romans, sacked the city. And despite the best efforts of some of Rome's greatest generals, including Flavius Stilicho and Aetius, they were often met with disappointing results, as the barbarian hordes were just too powerful, usually defeating the Romans, and these generals, seen as ambitious and half-barbarian traitors, were often killed. With the army and rulers and economy weak, the Christian church was becoming the strongest thing in the western half of the empire, and the legionaries could not hold back the barbarian threats, as Rome's borders were overwhelmed by new barbarian tribes, such as the Lombards, Franks, Celts, and Goths, who continued to devastate the Romans. While the East, soon to be known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to flourish, experiencing an economic boom and having a robust army, they were not able to relieve the West, and the West continued to be devastated by barbarian invasions over and over again, as they were devastated over and over again by new tribes of barbarians, including the Lombards, Franks, Celts, Goths, Ostrogoths, and Visigoths. These groups were relentless and continued to settle in the empire and were usually either paid off or hired only to turn on them. Many believed, like Flavius Aetius, the general of the 420s and 30s, that Rome could hold on. A half-barbarian general, he was able to use his influence to control Valentinian III, the emperor who succeeded Honorius, to be the major defender and healer of Rome. However, as half a barbarian, he was never trusted, nor did he have the manpower nor resources available to stop the barbarian incursions. Instead, he turned to a more powerful barbarian tribe to help him. The Huns had swept out of the Asian steppe and created a large empire in Central Europe. They became allies to the Romans, once again being offered land, payment, and food. When this was voided, under the leadership of Attila, who had united them, one of the greatest conquerors in human history, they turned on the Romans, creating an existential threat to both sides of the empire. Having built a massive empire with many soldiers, Attila's forces were able to rapidly invade the West. These forces seemed unstoppable, but the Romans would stand in their way. The mighty horsepower and cavalry would be met by the Romans, mainly led by Aetius and a barbarian force, at the Battle of the Catalan Fields in 451. It was an indecisive and extraordinarily bloody battle, and one of the most consequential in Roman history. However, Aetius would not survive. He was assassinated soon after by Valentinian, who wanted power for himself, who would die soon after, and it was not the sword, but the Lord who would stop Attila, as Pope Leo met with him and parleyed, getting Attila to agree to return to his empire, where he died shortly after in 455. However, the barbarian incursions continued, and no miracle or intervention would save Rome. As the Franks ripped Gaul out of the Roman hands, the Celts took Britannia, the Visigoths took Spain, and the Vandals took over North Africa, the breadbasket of Rome. In 457, Rome was once again sacked, and this time, recovery seemed almost impossible. However, the East stood tall and stood strong, being able to settle with the barbarians, making peace and settling them in their lands, as well as keeping up with their payments. They were wealthier and stronger. In 457, Maurian, probably the last decent emperor the West ever had, took power. He desperately tried to restore Roman lands and was pretty successful until Ricimer, an ambitious general, made sure that he was assassinated. Ricimer would continue to appoint figureheads and puppets until 472, when he also was assassinated. And with the West in total chaos, the restoration of it seemed impossible, even with intervention from the East. The barbarians had enacted revenge for years of mistreatment, lack of payment, and for centuries of oppression, conquest, enslavement, torture, and murder. The Roman Empire was on its last legs, only holding on to Italy, small parts of Gaul, and Austria. In 475, another ambitious general, Orestes, put his son, Romulus Augustus, on the throne. Aptly and serendipitously, the little Augustus was named after the founder and first emperor of Rome, and would turn out to be its last emperor. In 476, the boy emperor, who was no boy wonder, would surrender to Odoacer. The king of the Goths would depose the young boy and send him into exile, and not wanting to take the Roman Empire for himself, would declare himself king of the Goths, ending the Western Roman Empire with no one to fill its shoes. Italy was soon occupied by other barbarians, including the Lombards and Goths, and it was soon after this that Zeno, the Roman emperor in the East, decided that he wanted the land for himself. He commissioned Theodoric of the Ostrogoths to defeat Odoacer and claim the land, which Theodoric did in the 480s, becoming Theodoric the Great. The Eastern Romans, later known as the Byzantine Empire, not until the 16th century, would continue to dominate the Italian peninsula for centuries to come. But in Spain, the Visigoths created a kingdom. The Celts took over Britannia, and later the Saxons would come. The Franks were establishing a kingdom in Gaul, now called after them France. Well, Theodoric's Ostrogoths took Italy, and the Vandals took North Africa. The Eastern Roman Empire would continue to survive, eventually becoming its own distinct empire based in Constantinople, speaking Greek and practicing Orthodox Christianity. Zeno would be one of many emperors in the East who would desperately try to reclaim the West. However, the Western Roman Empire was dead, and no effort by no emperor, no matter how great or powerful he was, could restore it. And with the Western and Roman Empire gone, perhaps only one more man can be considered a true Roman emperor. But the Roman Empire, for all intents and purposes, for all its great might, expanse, wealth, and ingenuity, was gone and was to never return. After the death of Theodosius the Great, the Roman Empire was divided, and the decline of the western half of it could not be swifter. Swifter even than the barbarian hordes swarming into the empire, too numerous to count in their tribes, former guns for hire turning on the Romans. Swifter than the minds of the stupid rulers, who killed their best men because they were jealous of them. Swifter than the continual degradation of the Roman army and the loss of the territories that had once been part of the Western Roman Empire. Swifter than the power assumed by these barbarians as they sacked the city. Swifter than the decay of Roman morals, infrastructure, and law. Swifter than the fires that burned through the sackings of Rome in 410 and 457. Finally, in 476, Romulus Augustulus, the last Roman emperor, was deposed, the Goths and King Odoacer gaining control over Augustulus and the Roman throne. However, they did not put a new emperor in the throne, and soon Odoacer was deposed by Theodoric, who swore allegiance to the Byzantines, the Eastern Roman Empire, that not only survived, but would thrive. It did not have to deal with the heavy incursions comparable to the Western Roman Empire. It did not have to deal with barbarian invasions. In fact, the Eastern Roman Empire was in the midst of an economic boom, and although they did not see themselves as Byzantines, they spoke Greek. They embraced the philosophy of the ancient Greeks. They relied on the breadbaskets of Egypt and North Africa. Their armies were made of natural-born citizens, and their forces were strong and powerful, as were their rulers, especially Justinian the Great. Justinian, perhaps the greatest Byzantine emperor ever, is perhaps also the last true Roman emperor, the last emperor to sit upon the precipice of controlling both the West and the East, the emperor who continued the elevation of Constantinople from an old Greek town into the new Rome, into the central city of the world, the Justinian who put the church above everything, except perhaps himself. But some piety must remain. After all, it's hard to become a saint. But ironically, that saintly man relied on an ex-burlesque prostitute, his wife, Theodora, one of the most cunning, beautiful, and intelligent women, not just of that period, but of any period in history, to be his anchor and his support. She guided him, advised him, and supported him in everything he did, and at his darkest moment, she was there for him. Without her, his glorious 38-year reign might have ended in total tragedy in just 5. When the Nika riots hit the Hippodrome in Constantinople in 532, the riots soon turned to revolution, with the crowds calling for the blood of the emperor who was mistreating them. It was Theodora who encouraged Justinian not to flee, but to put down the revolt violently and ruthlessly, using his best general and second-best advisor, Belisarius, to do so. 30,000 were killed, but Justinian stabilized his hold on the empire. As he implemented a new law code that would set the legal bar high for the next 8 centuries, he utilized Belisarius to his best advantage, to hammer the barbarians. Belisarius reconquered large swaths of the Western Roman Empire and nearly doubled the size of the Byzantines. Without Belisarius and Justinian trusting him, the Byzantine Empire would not have ascended to such grandeur in the middle of the 6th century. All the while, Justinian and Theodora presided over a powerful court full of splendor and wealth. And as the booty and loot of the campaigns came in, they were quickly dispensed to pay for more war and for the building of Constantinople, as Justinian wanted to exceed even Constantine's great building projects in the city upon the sea. His greatest contribution to the city is perhaps one of the most famous symbols in all of the world, the Hagia Sophia. Today a mosque, it was originally designed as a church, Holy Wisdom, and is one of the most lavish and beautiful cathedrals in all the world, with its high vaults and beautiful domes, inviting lights, and amazing displays. A cathedral this grand must have cost a pretty penny, and it did, and it took over 5 years to complete, and Justinian made sure to give credit to where credit was due and honor the Lord. But he also made sure in his hubris to remind the Lord who had built the cathedral, even in its mosaics. Beautiful and impressive to this day, the cathedral is either the last great bit of Roman architecture or the first great medieval cathedral. He had built like Hadrian, conquered like Trajan, governed and reformed like Augustus. He had seemingly brought Rome back from the dead, and nothing could stand in his way, even his gross spending habits. Nothing stood in his way, except nature. The Justinian plague, the first recorded pandemic in all of history, would take the lives of 15 and 100 million people between 541 and 549. It would even threaten the life of the emperor, who would barely survive, becoming a shell of his former self, weak and paranoid in his later years. Meanwhile, his greatest strength, Theodora, died of cancer. The transformative reign would come to an end with not a bang, but a whimper. His tax base and population depleted, his manpower sorely inadequate to hold on to his territories, and his own personal strength depleted, Justinian would spend the last 15 years of his reign in decline, with his empire also in decline. He would die at the age of 83 after nearly 40 years on the throne, and despite this weak ending, it does not take away from the grandeur and the splendor of Justinian, his power, his despotism, his ability to control, his ability to build and conquer. All of this makes him, as an emperor, less a Byzantine and more a Roman. Want to hear some bad history? Top 10 Roman emperors. X to doubt, please. Lower. Much lower. Septimius Severus, no. Aurelian, about right. Vespasian needs to be lower. Constantine, higher. Put the years, don't be lazy. Nerva, lower. Nowhere near the top 10. Antoninus Pius, lower. 10 at best. Marcus Aurelius, about right. 4 is about right for him. Octavian, that's Julius Caesar, not Octavian, higher. Hadrian, lower. And Trajan, a little bit lower. That was bad, but here's an actual top 10 with actual reasons. At 10, Antoninus Pius. Had it easy, but a good and competent leader. 9, Aurelian. In just 5 years, reconquered the Roman Empire from the barbarians. 8, Diocletian. Stabilized the empire, giving it another century of life after a century of utter chaos. 7, Domitian. Only Roman emperor to ever fix the currency crisis. 6, Claudius. Conquered Britannia, great administrator. 5, Marcus Aurelius. Defended and governed well, all while writing badass philosophy. 4, Hadrian. Greatest Roman builder ever. 3, Constantine. Reshaped the Roman Empire, even giving it a new capital. 2, Trajan. Greatest conqueror Rome ever had. 1, Augustus. Created the imperial system.